"Excuse me, sir, but this isn't right." James Carter's voice carried across the empty bus depot, soft but firm, as his weathered hands clutched the edge of the worn steering wheel. The morning air was damp with mist, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, casting long, uncertain shadows across the cracked concrete floor. A group of uniformed officers stepped onto the platform, boots clicking against the metal grates, badges gleaming under the pale illumination, their eyes scanning James with a mix of suspicion and amusement. His gray hair glinted under the weak light as he straightened his back, the lines of his face deep from years of early mornings and long routes through Atlanta's busiest streets. "Sir, we need your license and registration," one of them said, voice tinged with condescension, as if speaking to a child. James reached slowly into his jacket pocket, producing the papers with deliberate care, his fingers brushing the creased edges, and his eyes met the officer's for a brief moment, steady and unyielding. The bus behind him sat silent, empty seats lined in neat rows, the soft hum of the heater the only background sound. Commuters nearby paused, unsure whether to intervene or keep their distance, the mist curling around their shoes like whispers. James took a measured breath, glancing toward the windshield, where raindrops clung like tiny jewels, reflecting the pale streetlights outside. "I assure you, everything is in order," he said calmly, yet the authority in his tone was unmistakable, quiet but firm, radiating a dignity that the officers seemed unprepared to confront. One of the younger cops, smirking, leaned slightly closer, gesturing toward the bus as though to question his position there, while another reached to adjust his belt, a subtle display of control. James kept his posture relaxed but resolute, the corners of his mouth tightening just slightly, the weight of decades pressing lightly on his shoulders, yet he stood tall, unbroken by the silent judgment around him. Outside, the fog swirled, blurring the distant buildings into ghostly silhouettes, and the faint smell of wet asphalt mingled with the metallic scent of the depot. A clock on the wall ticked in rhythm with James's heartbeat, each second drawing out the tension as he waited for the officers to make their next move. Passengers shuffled at the far end of the platform, glancing over with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, their eyes catching the subtle firmness in James's gaze, the quiet confidence that spoke louder than any words. The lead officer's brow furrowed, scanning the documents, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the clipboard, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the stillness. James's knuckles whitened slightly as he adjusted his grip, yet he did not flinch or show irritation, the calm in his demeanor a stark contrast to the tentative aggression in the officer's stance. A pigeon flitted across the depot roof, its wings cutting through the mist, and the soft patter of rain began anew, drumming lightly on the metal roof, echoing through the hollow space. James inhaled deeply, feeling the cool, damp air fill his lungs, grounding him, steadying the quiet storm that hummed beneath the surface of the encounter. The officers exchanged glances, unease flickering in their eyes, momentarily breaking the rhythm of their performance of authority, as if sensing that the man before them was more than he appeared, and that the respect they assumed by default was not to be commanded but earned. The hum of the heater shifted, a low, resonant vibration through the bus, as James slowly lifted his chin, meeting each gaze in turn, unafraid, unshaken, the faint light catching the silver threads in his hair, glinting like a crown of endurance, a testament to years of patience, resilience, and unwavering integrity in the face of a world that often underestimated him. James Carter wiped his hands on the edge of his worn jacket, feeling the rough texture of the fabric against his skin as he stepped away from the bus, the early morning drizzle leaving faint trails along the brim of his cap. He adjusted his posture, shoulders squared, back straight, his eyes scanning the rows of empty seats and the misty expanse of asphalt that stretched toward the depot exit. Every route he had driven over the past 40 years seemed to hum quietly beneath his feet, an invisible network of streets and avenues that he knew like the back of his weathered hands. In his pocket, a folded photograph of his son, Ethan, peered out slightly, catching a droplet of rain that reflected the muted glow of the street lamps. Ethan, now 35, had grown up learning discipline, patience, and focus from the stories James had shared during long nights after late shifts, the bus idling quietly outside the small apartment they had shared in the heart of Atlanta. The depot smelled faintly of damp concrete and gasoline, a scent that James had grown accustomed to, one that reminded him of years of dedication and service to the community. The rain intensified slightly, pattering softly against the roof of the bus, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet intensity of the moment. Passengers who had started to gather nearby glanced furtively toward James, noting the dignity in his stance, the calm resolve in the lines of his face, the unspoken story of a life built on integrity. He exhaled slowly, the mist escaping his lips in small, visible clouds, and adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, the weight inside nothing compared to the legacy he carried in his heart. The depot clock ticked in steady rhythm, each second a reminder of the meticulous timing that governed his life, each minute a reflection of the countless mornings he had begun before dawn, ensuring that every passenger reached their destination safely. James walked toward a nearby bench, the worn wood slick under the drizzle, his shoes leaving faint impressions in the shallow puddles along the platform. He sat, hands clasped loosely, eyes briefly closing as he allowed himself a moment to reflect, to think about the journey that had led him here, about the early mornings and late nights, the sacrifices and small victories, the moments of quiet pride when a child had waved as he passed, or when a stranger had offered a nod of appreciation. The rain fell in a gentle cadence, each drop tapping softly on his cap, a metronome that measured not only the passage of time, but also the resilience etched into his bones, a silent testament to the strength he had carried through years of service. Around him, the depot continued its slow awakening, the low murmur of arriving buses blending with the distant rumble of traffic, the soft squeak of shoes against wet concrete punctuating the rhythm of the morning. James's gaze shifted briefly toward the horizon, where the first pale hints of sunrise struggled to penetrate the thick mist, casting a diffuse light that shimmered against the wet surfaces and highlighted the faint wrinkles in his hands and face, each line a story, a memory, a marker of endurance. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, feeling the familiar resistance of the fabric against his neck, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to cross his face, one born not of triumph, but of quiet certainty, the knowledge that he had navigated a lifetime of challenges with honor and care. The depot lights flickered once more, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the rows of empty seats, the subtle play of light and dark mirroring the balance James had always sought between caution and courage, between humility and steadfastness, a balance that would serve as the foundation for the day ahead and for the unforeseen events that would soon unfold, all quietly held within the measured steps of a man who had learned to carry both pride and patience in equal measure. As he rose from the bench, the sound of rain mingled with the distant hum of engines, and James felt the familiar sense of purpose settle into his chest, the steady rhythm of a lifetime of service guiding his movements, his thoughts gently turning toward Ethan, toward the lessons passed down, toward the quiet power that lay within the family bond, ready to be revealed when the moment called for it. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the depot, sharp and deliberate, as the group of officers advanced toward James Carter, their polished shoes clicking against the damp concrete. The early morning mist hung in the air, curling around their legs and rising like faint smoke, obscuring the far edges of the platform. Each officer carried an air of authority, their posture rigid, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the belts. Where their radios and equipment were clipped, eyes fixed on James as if he were a problem to be solved. James adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, feeling the familiar weight settle against his hip, a grounding reminder of his decades of routine, of lives transported safely across the city streets, of mornings begun before the sun had crested the skyline. The buses lined up in neat rows, their metal bodies slick with moisture, windows fogged with condensation, faint reflections of neon signs blinking from across the street. James's gaze shifted slowly across the empty depot, taking in the scattered trash bins, the faded yellow lines marking parking spots, the puddles forming shallow mirrors of the overcast sky above. He inhaled deeply, letting the damp, cool air fill his lungs, and exhaled steadily, the motion deliberate, a visible breath escaping into the mist, a small yet defiant gesture of calm in the presence of looming confrontation. The lead officer stepped forward, a clipboard held at chest height, eyes scanning the documents James had provided with practiced efficiency, but his smirk betrayed an undercurrent of doubt, as though he did not expect the papers to be in proper order. James met the officer's gaze steadily, unflinching, a quiet challenge carried in the lines of his face, in the set of his jaw, in the patience embedded in every measured movement of his hands. The rain began to intensify, light at first, then gradually forming a soft rhythm against the metal roof of the depot, blending with the distant hum of idling engines and the muted chatter of early commuters. A pigeon fluttered along the edge of the platform, wings beating softly against the mist, its presence almost imperceptible, yet adding a sense of life to the otherwise still scene. James's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where pale shafts of sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense cloud cover, casting a diffuse glow over the depot, illuminating the subtle wrinkles on his hands and the gray strands in his hair, a testament to the years of experience, endurance, and quiet strength he had carried with him through countless days of service. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the gentle pull of gravity against his frame, and allowed a slow, deliberate blink, letting his mind settle, cataloging the environment, noting every detail. The faint rustle of a newspaper carried by the wind, the soft hiss of tires as a bus pulled slowly into position, the distant wail of a train horn far beyond the city streets. Passengers waiting at the far end of the platform glanced briefly at the interaction, some with curiosity, others with apprehension, yet all drawn subtly to the presence of James, to the quiet dignity he exuded in contrast to the rigid posture and clipped movements of the officers. A low hum emanated from the heating system inside the depot office, vibrating faintly through the floorboards and reinforcing the tension in the air, each beat in harmony with James's calm yet alert heartbeat. He straightened once more, the weight of the years evident in the lines of his shoulders, but his posture remained firm, unyielding, the embodiment of a life lived with integrity and conscientiousness. The officers exchanged a brief glance, subtle yet loaded with unspoken communication, and for a fleeting moment, the confident facade of authority wavered as they registered the composure and resilience of the man before them, a man whose presence demanded recognition beyond the superficial judgments of age or occupation. James's fingers brushed against the edges of his messenger bag once more, steadying himself as he prepared to continue the conversation, to navigate the unfolding moment with patience and clarity, aware that every small gesture, every controlled movement, conveyed far more than words could capture in the still, misty expanse of the depot. James Carter took a slow, deliberate step toward the bus, his polished shoes making soft splashes in the shallow puddles formed by the steady drizzle. He adjusted the brim of his cap, letting the droplets roll down the edges, the mist curling around him like a faint halo, emphasizing the quiet dignity in his posture. The officers remained a few steps behind, their expressions fixed, a mixture of curiosity and impatience evident in the subtle furrows of their brows. James opened the bus door, the hinge, groaning softly in the otherwise silent depot, and the interior smelled faintly of damp upholstery and the faint tang of diesel exhaust lingering from previous routes. He reached out to secure the handrail, his calloused fingers gripping it with a calm strength, and his eyes swept over the empty seats, the rows aligned with meticulous precision, the early morning light reflecting softly off the slightly fogged windows. Outside, the city was waking slowly, the streetlights beginning to dim as the first hints of sunlight pushed against the gray clouds, casting a gentle glow that caught the wet surfaces, turning puddles into scattered mirrors of the sky above. James began speaking in measured tones, his voice carrying softly but firmly across the small space of the depot, explaining the proper procedure for fare collection, the routine he had followed for decades, each step precise and practiced. The officers leaned slightly forward, their hands resting lightly on their equipment, noting the steadiness in James's movements, the clarity in his speech, the quiet authority that came from years of experience and a life dedicated to service. He moved through the aisle, checking the floor for any obstructions, straightening a folded newspaper left behind by a passenger the previous evening, adjusting a slightly crooked seatbelt, small gestures that revealed a meticulous attention to detail and a commitment to the comfort and safety of those who would rely on the bus. The faint sound of water dripping from the roof above created a soft, rhythmic percussion, accompanying the subtle creaks of the seats and the muted hum of engines warming outside. James's gaze lifted briefly to the depot clock, noting the precise passage of time, each second measured, each minute accounted for, the rhythm of his day mapped in patterns familiar and reliable. He paused near the front, turning to ensure that the doors were secure, the safety lights operational, and the fare box functioning properly, demonstrating a quiet competence that commanded attention without demanding it. The officers exchanged brief glances, unease flickering in their expressions as they recognized the depth of knowledge and experience displayed in James's calm, precise actions, a contrast to their initial assumptions based on appearances and age. James moved toward the platform exit, gesturing toward the line of arriving passengers with a polite nod, his voice softening yet remaining confident as he welcomed them aboard, guiding them with practiced courtesy, the mist mingling with the scent of wet asphalt and faint traces of coffee from a nearby vendor. The subtle interplay of light and shadow across the bus interior created a cinematic texture, highlighting the contours of James's face, the steady resolve in his eyes, and the disciplined movements of his hands, each action conveying integrity and calm assurance. The officers stood momentarily, observing, the rhythm of their own breathing syncing unconsciously with the measured cadence of James's movements, the tension in the air shifting imperceptibly as they recognized that authority was not solely conferred by uniform or position, but also by experience, knowledge, and the quiet confidence born of a lifetime of dedicated practice. The rain intensified slightly, tapping gently against the roof in a soothing, consistent rhythm, the mist rising around the edges of the depot platform, softening the harsh lines of concrete and steel, creating a serene, almost suspended moment where observation, patience, and integrity intersected visibly in the figure of James Carter, a man whose presence quietly reshaped the perception of those who watched. The tension in the depot thickened as the officers lingered, their expressions shifting subtly from condescension to frustration, the mist curling around their legs as if to emphasize the momentary imbalance of control. James Carter stood with a calm resilience, his posture unwavering, eyes following the faint pattern of rain tracing the edges of the roof, each droplet a reminder of the quiet persistence he had carried through decades of work, of schedules kept and lives transported safely across the city streets. One officer shuffled his feet, shifting weight from heel to toe, a muted attempt at reasserting authority, while another adjusted the collar of his uniform, the crisp material resisting the damp air, the faint scent of rain mingling with the sharp tang of polished shoes. James reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket, fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper, the texture familiar and grounding, and as he drew it out, his eyes met the lead officer's gaze, steady and unflinching, conveying without words the dignity of experience and the quiet command of someone who knew his own worth. Around them, the depot seemed to hold its breath, the soft hum of distant engines, the rhythmic drip of rain from the metal roof, and the muted squeak of tires forming a subtle symphony that underscored the unspoken standoff. Passengers and bystanders paused at the edges of the scene, the tension palpable, eyes flicking between the officers and James, recognizing in his calm movements a strength that contrasted sharply with the rigid gestures and clipped commands of the uniformed men. James shifted his weight slightly, the worn soles of his shoes making soft impressions in the wet concrete, and adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, the familiar weight a reminder of the routine and responsibility he had carried for years, a symbol of the life he had built on patience, precision, and care. The officers exchanged quick, uneasy glances, the cadence of their breath betraying a hint of uncertainty, as if the quiet authority emanating from James challenged their assumptions and required reconsideration. He gestured toward the bus, ensuring that the doors were properly secured, the interior lights casting a gentle glow over the rows of empty seats, the soft reflection on fogged windows creating an almost ethereal quality to the scene. Each measured movement, each deliberate adjustment, communicated competence and composure, a visual narrative of a lifetime of commitment and careful attention. The mist swirled around the edges of the platform, softening harsh lines, blurring distinctions, and creating a sense of suspension, as if the moment itself were waiting for the next action to unfold. James's gaze lifted to the depot clock, noting the passing seconds with a sense of rhythm, each tick a marker of time observed, measured, and respected. The officers' faces reflected subtle signs of doubt, a recognition that authority was not solely derived from rank or uniform, but could be found in steadiness, integrity, and the quiet confidence of a man who had long navigated challenges with patience and skill. The soft patter of rain increased slightly, the droplets falling in a steady rhythm, harmonizing with the ambient noises of the depot, creating a subtle tension and a heightened awareness of the moment, where control, perception, and respect intertwined in the stillness. James took a small, deliberate step toward the edge of the platform, hands lightly resting on the railing, his eyes briefly scanning the distant cityscape, the low hum of traffic and the faint flicker of neon lights adding layers of texture to the morning tableau. The officers remained a step behind, their body language betraying a growing awareness of the understated authority and composure held by James, a silent acknowledgement that the balance of the moment was shifting, that the patience, knowledge, and dignity he carried were reshaping the dynamics in subtle, undeniable ways. Every movement, every glance, every breath in the depot seemed to echo with the quiet weight of experience and the unspoken lesson that respect and control often reside not in outward displays, but in measured actions and steadfast presence. James Carter stepped aside from the depot platform, the drizzle now settling into a soft, steady rhythm that formed a delicate curtain around the edges of the buses and the faint outline of the city beyond. He inhaled slowly, the cool air filling his lungs, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and distant pine from the small cluster of trees at the corner of the lot. His eyes followed the patterns of puddles gathering in the shallow depressions of the concrete, each one reflecting fragments of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead and the muted glow of street lamps reaching out through the mist. He felt the familiar weight of time pressing gently on his shoulders, the decades of early mornings and long shifts threading quietly through each measured step he took across the platform. The depot around him seemed suspended, the rain softening the edges of steel and concrete, creating a subtle hush over the usual morning bustle. He paused near the edge of the lot, hands resting lightly on the railing, noticing the intricate play of reflections in the shallow pools, the way the light refracted through the mist, casting fleeting, transient images that shifted with every ripple in the water. James allowed himself a moment to observe, to breathe, to appreciate the rhythm of the world moving around him, the quiet interaction of natural elements and human structures, a gentle symphony of mist, light, and shadow that felt almost meditative. The distant rumble of a train began faintly, a low vibration under the soles of his shoes, mixing with the soft hiss of tires from buses idling in the distance, creating a layered, subtle soundscape that resonated with the calm steadiness of his own heartbeat. He closed his eyes briefly, the drizzle tracing tiny paths along the lines of his face, each droplet accentuating the quiet strength he carried in the tilt of his chin and the calm in his posture. A soft wind brushed against his jacket, stirring the fabric lightly and carrying with it the scent of morning rain mingled with faint hints of exhaust and wet leaves. James shifted slightly, feeling the solid ground beneath him, the texture of worn concrete under his shoes grounding him in the moment, each step deliberate, each breath measured, a continuation of the quiet discipline that had guided him through years of service. Across the lot, the lights reflected off the wet metal of the buses, creating a soft interplay of shadow and illumination, highlighting the subtle movements of the officers still lingering, their presence a muted tension in the otherwise peaceful tableau. James's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the first hints of sun attempted to pierce the cloud cover. The light diffused into soft shades of gold and gray that danced across the mist, brushing faint glimmers across the puddles and the wet surfaces of the depot. He allowed himself to exhale fully, letting the rhythm of the rain, the whisper of the wind, and the muted hum of the city beyond settle around him. creating a moment of pause, reflection, and quiet resilience. Each subtle sound, each flicker of light, each gentle motion in the mist reinforced the sense of presence, of integrity, of patience, and of steadfastness that James carried silently with him, a steady beacon amidst the soft, gray morning. James Carter's gaze shifted subtly toward the far edge of the depot, where the mist began to thin and the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through, creating delicate shafts of gold that highlighted the gentle curvature of the puddles and the glistening surfaces of the buses. In that softened light, a figure emerged from the haze, moving with a purposeful precision that immediately drew attention, a tall man in a well-fitted jacket, his stride confident, measured, almost imperceptibly commanding. James's chest lifted slightly, a flicker of recognition passing across his features, and a quiet sense of anticipation threaded through the cool air. The officers, who had lingered behind, stiffened as the figure approached, their prior confidence tempered by the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the quiet authority radiating from the newcomer palpable even from a distance. The man's eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the scene briefly, settling finally on James with an intensity that was both protective and assured, the weight of experience evident in the calm precision of his movement. James allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the presence, and the tension that had filled the depot moments before seemed to bend, subtly recalibrated by the unspoken knowledge that the balance of authority was shifting. The rain continued its soft cadence, the droplets forming tiny prisms as they caught the emerging light, casting fleeting, scattered reflections across the concrete, and the air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and faint hints of pine from the surrounding trees. The newcomer moved closer, hands relaxed at his sides, yet every motion suggested control, a quiet strength that did not demand attention but naturally commanded it. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier assertions of power faltering as they instinctively recognized that the scene had changed, that the presence beside James carried implications beyond ordinary comprehension. James remained calm, a subtle curve of a smile touching his lips, the faint lines around his eyes deepening with the knowledge of what was about to unfold, the latent capability that had always been quietly present now visible in the poised, deliberate presence of his son, Ethan Carter. The mist swirled gently around them, softening the edges of the depot, the fluorescent lights overhead catching on the damp surfaces, reflecting subtle hues across the scene. Ethan's gaze briefly swept the area, registering the position and posture of the officers, noting their tentative movements, and then returned to his father, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a language of understanding that required no words. The rhythm of the rain, the distant hum of traffic, and the soft creak of the depot structure seemed to harmonize with the moment, creating a cinematic tableau where the quiet dignity of James met the controlled presence of Ethan, a powerful but composed contrast to the hesitant, uncertain stance of the officers. Each second stretched with significance, the space between breaths filled with anticipation, observation, and subtle recognition of unspoken truths. The soft flicker of the streetlights reflected off the wet concrete, highlighting the tension and the anticipation, the edges of shadows dancing lightly across the figures, emphasizing the quiet power and careful composure of the men, one a figure of seasoned experience, the other a manifestation of latent skill and preparation. The officers' hands shifted slightly, their gaze darting, the earlier smugness giving way to subtle unease, and in that charged but silent moment, the understanding that respect, patience, and readiness could redefine the dynamics of authority became undeniably clear. James inhaled deeply, shoulders relaxed, yet every muscle poised with quiet confidence, his eyes meeting those of his son briefly, and the scene held a suspended weight, the mist, the rain, and the filtered sunlight creating a tableau where dignity, skill, and calm command converged in an unspoken, visually compelling declaration of presence and control. The officers remained frozen, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and sudden awareness, as Ethan Carter stepped closer to his father, the morning sunlight now filtering fully through the thinning mist, illuminating the damp concrete in a soft golden hue that seemed to reflect the quiet resolution of the scene. James Carter allowed a small, steady smile to form, the subtle curve of his lips carrying the weight of years spent navigating life with patience, integrity, and resilience, a silent acknowledgement of the balance now restored. The soft rhythm of raindrops pattering against the roof of the depot blended seamlessly with the distant hum of city traffic and the faint creak of bus doors, creating an ambient backdrop that underscored the profound shift in perception and authority. Ethan's presence exuded a controlled confidence, a calm yet unmistakable command that required no overt action, merely the recognition of his readiness and capability, which resonated clearly with both his father and the officers around them. The mist continued to drift lazily across the platform, wrapping the depot in a gentle haze that softened edges and muted the tension, allowing the significance of the moment to settle naturally over the environment. James placed a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, the gesture subtle but laden with trust, the shared understanding between them palpable, a silent communication that spoke volumes more than words could convey. The officers slowly lowered their hands, their posture relaxing as the realization of the situation became undeniable, the prior air of superiority giving way to an understated acknowledgement of the competence and presence before them. A gentle breeze moved through the depot, lifting stray papers and sending ripples across shallow puddles, the light catching on the moving water to create fleeting reflections of the figures present, a cinematic interplay of motion, shadow, and light that accentuated the quiet power and integrity of the Carters. James and Ethan moved together toward the exit of the depot, their steps deliberate and unhurried, the subtle synchronicity of their movements reinforcing the bond and mutual understanding that had guided them to this moment. The officers watched, subdued and reflective, the rhythm of their breathing aligning momentarily with the natural cadence of the environment, the rain, the distant city hum, and the soft glow of the rising sun combining to create a tableau of understated authority, respect, and reconciliation. James glanced at his son, a nod of affirmation passing between them, and the depot, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now held a sense of calm resolution, the interplay of natural light and mist casting a serene, almost ethereal quality over the space. Every small sound, from the subtle drip of water to the faint echo of footsteps on wet concrete, seemed to emphasize the shift, each note reinforcing the quiet lesson that true respect and authority are earned through composure, integrity, and the thoughtful exercise of presence. The buses lined the depot, their metal surfaces glinting in the early sunlight, the seats and floors reflecting subtle patterns of light and shadow, and the surrounding cityscape seemed to lean in slightly, as though acknowledging the change in atmosphere, the equilibrium that had been restored by patience, wisdom, and the steady, unspoken power of the Carters. James inhaled deeply, the cool, damp air filling his lungs with a sense of clarity and calm, his eyes scanning the depot one last time before moving forward, each step resonating with the unspoken assurance that dignity, preparedness, and quiet strength had prevailed, leaving the officers with a lasting impression of what it truly means to carry authority with integrity and grace. James Carter and his son Ethan stepped off the depot platform, the morning sunlight now fully embracing the wet surfaces, casting long, soft shadows across the rows of buses and reflecting in the scattered puddles with a golden shimmer. The mist that had lingered all morning lifted gradually, revealing the distant outlines of buildings softened by the early light, the city slowly awakening to the rhythm of a new day. James adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, the weight inside a familiar reminder of years spent transporting lives, of routines perfected, of a quiet resilience built over decades. Ethan moved beside him with measured steps, a calm presence that radiated confidence and readiness, yet his posture and movements were entirely composed, emphasizing a quiet authority that did not need to be announced aloud. Around them, the depot hummed softly, the ambient sounds of distant engines, faint chatter, and the subtle tapping of raindrops still lingering in shallow puddles forming a gentle backdrop to the scene, a layered texture that underscored the calm resolution of the moment. The officers remained behind, their expressions subdued, the tension of the morning replaced with a quiet reflection, their earlier assumptions fading as they processed the subtle but unmistakable display of integrity, composure, and presence demonstrated by the Carters. James glanced at his son, a small, deliberate nod passing between them, a silent exchange of trust and understanding that spoke volumes, affirming the bond that had guided them through challenges and prepared them for this precise moment. The soft breeze stirred lightly, lifting small leaves and carrying the faint aroma of wet pavement and distant pine, each detail a reminder of the environment's subtle influence on the senses and on perception, highlighting the delicate interplay between stillness and motion, calm and awareness. As they walked toward the exit, each step resonated with purpose, the sound of shoes on wet concrete punctuating the serene rhythm of their passage, while sunlight glinted off the wet metal surfaces of the buses, creating fleeting, fragmented reflections that mirrored the sense of equilibrium and resolution now present. The depot, once tense and charged, now held a serene order, a visual and auditory harmony that amplified the impression of dignity, preparation, and understated authority carried by James and Ethan. Every element, the soft shimmer of sunlight on water, the gentle shifting of mist, the distant hum of the city, the reflective surfaces of buses, converged to create a cinematic tableau, a moment frozen in clarity and subtle grandeur where patience, resilience, and quiet strength prevailed. James allowed himself a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, carrying with it the faint sense of rain and asphalt, the slight chill brushing against his face, grounding him in the completeness of the moment. He glanced once more at the officers, who now observed silently, absorbing the lesson of humility and respect that had been communicated without a word, a presence felt rather than declared, the balance of the morning now resolved through measured integrity and quiet dignity. Ethan walked slightly ahead, casting a protective yet unobtrusive glance back toward his father, the shared awareness between them unspoken yet complete, a mutual recognition that the day had begun with challenge and now continued with calm assurance, each movement a testament to years of preparation, trust, and the enduring power of steadfast character. The depot stretched around them, bathed in morning light, the wet surfaces gleaming softly, the soft breeze carrying faint sounds of distant traffic and bird calls, an ambient score to the unfolding tableau that emphasized the serene triumph of patience, resilience, and composed authority, leaving the space imbued with a lasting impression of quiet power and unspoken respect that would linger long after the Carters had passed into the city streets.